Chapter 1. The Color of Magic. Fire roared through the bifurcated city of Ankh-Morpork. Where it licked the wizard's quarter, it burned blue and green, and was even laced with strange sparks of the eighth color, octarine. Where its outriders found their way into the vats and oil stores around the merchant street, it progressed in a series of blazing fountains and explosions. In the streets of the perfume blenders, it burned with a sweetness where it touched bundles of rare dry herbs in the storerooms of the drugmasters and made men go mad and talk to God. By now the whole of downtown Morpork was alight, and the richer, wealthier citizens of the Ankh on the far bank were bravely responding to the situation by feverishly demolishing bridges. But already the ships in the Morpork docks, laden with grain, cotton, and timber, and coated with tar, were blazing merrily, and their moorings, burnt to ashes, were breasting the river of the Ankh on the ebb tide, igniting riverside palaces and the boyars as they drifted like drowning fireflies toward the sea. In any case, sparks were riding the breeze and touching down far across the river, in hidden gardens and remote rickyards. The smoke from the merry burning rose miles high in a wind-sculpted black column that could be seen across the whole of Discworld. It was certainly impressive from the cool hilltop a few leagues away, where two figures were watching with considerable interest. The taller of the pair was chewing on a chicken leg and leaning on a sword that was only marginally shorter than the average man. If it wasn't for the air of wary intelligence about him, it might have been supposed that he was a barbarian from the Hublin Wastes. His partner was much shorter, wrapped from head to toe in a brown cloak. Later, when he has the occasion to move, be seen that he moves lightly, cat-like. The two had barely exchanged a word in the last 20 minutes, except for a short, inconclusive argument as to whether a particularly powerful explosion had been the oil-bond store or the workshop of Caribal the Enchanter. Money hinged on the fact. Now the big man finished gnawing the bone and tossed it into the grass, smiling ruefully. There go all those little alleyways. I liked them. He said. All the treasure houses, said the small man. He added thoughtfully. The gems burn? I wonder. 'Tis said they're kin to coal. All the gold melting and running down the gutters, said the big one, ignoring him. All the wine boiling in the barrels. There were rats, said his brown companion. Rats, I'll grant you. It was no place to be in high summer. That too. One can't help feeling, though, a momentary. He trailed off, then brightened. We owed old Fredor at the Crimson Leech 8 silver pieces, he added. The little man nodded. They were silent for a while, as a whole new series of explosions carved red lines across the hitherto dark section of the greatest city of the world. Then the big man stirred. Weasel. Yeah? I wonder who started it. The small swordsman was known as the Weasel, said nothing. He was watching the road in the ruddy light. Few had come that way since the Deosil gate had been the first to collapse in the shower of white-hot embers. But two were coming up it now. The Weasel's eyes, always at their sharpest in gloom and half-light, made out the shapes of two mounted men, and some sort of low beast behind them. Doubtless a rich merchant escaping with as much treasure as he could lay frantic hands on. The Weasel said as much to his companion, who sighed. The status of a footpad ill suits us, said the barbarian. But as you say, times are hard, and there are no soft beds tonight. He shifted his grip on the sword, and, as the leading rider drew near, stepped out onto the road and held a hand up, his face set in a grin nicely calculated to reassure yet threaten. Your pardon, sir, he began. The raider reined in his horse and drew back his hood. The big man looked into a face blotched with superficial burns and punctuated by tufts of singed beard. Even the eyebrows had gone. Bugger off, said the face. You're Brav the Hublander, aren't you? And here there is a little asterisk, which Terry Pratchett does to insert a little additional information on certain facts, wherever he feels like. This being the first one he ever used, I suppose. Bravd the Hublander. Asterisk right after that. The shape and cosmology of the disk system are perhaps worthy of note at this point. There are, of course, two major directions on the disk, hubward and rimward. And since the disk itself revolves at the rate of once every 800 days, in order to distribute the weight fairly on support of pachyderms, according to Reforgul of Krull, there are also two lesser directions, which are turnwise and widdershins. Since the disk's tiny orbiting sunlet maintains a fixed orbit while the majestic disk turns slowly beneath it, it will be readily deduced that a disk year consists of not 4 but 8 seasons. Summers are those times when the sun rises and sets at the nearest point on the rim, and winters are the occasions when it rises and sets around 90 degrees along the circumference. Thus, in the lands around the Circle Sea, year begins on Hogswatch night and progresses through a spring prime to its first midsummer, Small God's Eve, which is followed by autumn prime and straddling the half-year point, Crueltide, winter secondus, also known as spindle winter, since at this time the sun rises in the direction of the spin. Then comes secondus spring, and with summer too on its heels. The 3/4 mark of the year being night of All's Follow. The one night of the year, according to legend, when witches and warlocks stay in bed. The drifting leaves and frosty nights drag on towards Black Spindle Winter and New Hogswatch Night, nestling like a frozen jewel at its heart. Since the hub is never closely warmed by the weak sun, the lands there are locked in permafrost. The rim, on the other hand, is a region of sunny islands and balmy days. There are, of course, 8 days in a disk week, and 8 colors in its light spectrum. 8 is a number of some considerable occult significance on the disk, and must never ever be spoken by a wizard. Precisely why all the above should be so is not clear, but it goes some way to explain why, on the disk, gods are not so much worshipped as blamed. What that had to do with Brav the Hublander? I suppose because his name was Hublander. So he wanted to explain seasons and the directions on the disk. Which I guess makes sense, since everything is all circular. Anyway, we'll continue from, Bugger off, said the face. You're Brav the Hublander, aren't you? Brav became aware that he had fumbled the initiative. Darn. Just go away, will you? Said the rider. I just haven't got time for you. Do you understand? He looked around and added, That goes for your shadow-loving fleabag partner, too, wherever he's hiding. The weasel stepped up to the horse and peered at the disheveled figure. Why, it's Rincewind the wizard, isn't it? Oh man, that's Rincewind? I thought it was someone more important. I'm going to give Rincewind another voice, I think. 'Cause that's hard on my throat. He's going to be in a lot. He said in the tones of delight, meanwhile, filing the wizard's description of him in his memory for leisurely vengeance. I thought I recognized the voice. Brav spat and sheathed the sword. It was seldom worth tangling with wizards. They so rarely had any treasure worth speaking of. He talks pretty big for a gutter wizard, he muttered. You don't understand at all, said the wizard wearily. I'm so scared of you, my spine has turned to jelly. It's just that I'm suffering from an overdose of terror right now. I mean, when I've got over that, then I'll have time to be decently frightened of you. The weasel pointed toward the burning city. You been through that? He asked. The wizard rubbed a raw red hand across his eyes. I was there when it started. See him back there? He pointed down the road to where his traveling companion was, still approaching, having adopted a method of riding that involved falling out of the saddle every few seconds. Well, said the weasel. He started it, said Rincewind simply. Brob and Weasel looked at the figure, now hopping across the road with one foot in the stirrup. Fire raiser, is he? Said Rob at last. No, said Rincewind, not precisely. Let's just say that if complete and utter chaos were lightning, then he'd have to stand on top of a hilltop in a thunderstorm while wearing a wet copper armor and shouting, all gods are bastards, to get it. Then he'd be at the top sword to stand on a top. Okay. Let's just say that if complete and utter chaos were lightning, then he'd be the sort to stand on a hilltop in a thunderstorm wearing wet copper armor and shouting, all gods are bastards. Got any food? There's some chicken, said the weasel, in exchange for a story. What's his name? Said Brovd, who tended to lag behind in conversations. Twoflower. Twoflower, said Brovd. What a funny name. You, said Rincewind, dismounting, do not know the half of it. Chicken, you say? Deviled, said the weasel. The wizard groaned. That reminds me, added the weasel, snapping his finger. There was a really big explosion, about half an hour ago. That was the oil bond store going up, said Rincewind, wincing at the memory of the burning rain. Weasel turned and grinned expectantly toward his companion, who grunted and handed him over a coin from his pouch. Then there was a scream from the roadway, cut off abruptly. Rincewind did not look up from his chicken. One of the things he can't do, he can't ride a horse, he said. Then he stiffened, as if sandbagged by a sudden recollection, gave a small yelp of terror, and dashed into the gloom. When he returned, the being called Twoflower was hanging limply from his shoulder. It was small and skinny and dressed very oddly, in a pair of knee-length breeches, and a shirt in such a violent and vivid conflict of colors that Weasel's fastidious eye was offended even in the half-light. No bones broken by the feel of things, said Rincewind. He was breathing heavily. Brovd winked at Weasel and went to investigate the shape they assumed was a pack animal. You be wise to forget it, said the wizard without looking up from his examination of the unconscious Twoflower. Believe me, a power protects it. A spell? Said the weasel, squatting down. No, but magic of a kind, I think. Not the usual sort. I mean, it can turn gold into copper, while at the same time it is still gold. Makes men rich by destroying their possessions, and allows the weak to walk fearlessly among thieves. Passes through the strongest doors to leech most protected treasuries. Even now it has me enslaved. So that I must follow this madman willy-nilly and protect him from harm. It's stronger than you, Brovd, it is. I think more cunning than even you, Weasel. What's it called, then, this mighty magic? Rincewind shrugged. In our tongue, it's called reflected sound as of underground spirits. Is there any one? You must know that I am not only without artifice where magic is concerned. You must know that I am not without artifice where magic is concerned, said Weasel. Only last year that I assisted my friend there, part the notoriously powerful archmage of Ymetry from his staff, his belt of moon jewels, and his life, in that approximate order. I do not fear this reflected sound of underground spirits of which you speak. However, he added, you engage my interest. Perhaps you would care to tell me more. Rob looked at the shape on the road. It was closer now, and clearer in the pre-dawn light. It looked for all the world like a box on legs, he said. I'll tell you about it, said Rincewind, if there's any wine, that is. Down in the valley there was a roar and a hiss. Someone more thoughtful than the rest had ordered to be shut the big river gates that were the at the point where the Ankh flowed out of the Twin City. Denied its usual egress, the river had burst its banks and was pouring down the fire-ravaged streets. Soon the continent of flame had become a series of islands, each one growing smaller as the dark tide rose. And up from the city of fumes and smoke rose a broiling cloud of steam, covering the stars. Weasel thought it looked like some dark fungus or mushroom. The twin city of proud Ankh and pestilent Morpork, of which all other cities of time and space are, as it were, mere reflections, had stood many assaults in its long and crowded history, and had always risen to flourish again. So the fire and subsequent flood, which destroyed everything left that was not flammable, and added particularly noisome flux to the survivors' problems, did not mark its end. Rather, it was a fiery punctuation mark, a coal-like comma, or a salamander semicolon in a continuing story. Several days before these events, a ship came up the Ankh on the dawn tide, and fetched up, among any others, in the maze of wharves and docks on the Morpork shore. It carried a cargo of pink pearls, milk nuts, pumice, some official letters for the patrician of Ankh, and a man. It was a man who engaged the attention of blind Hugh, one of the beggars on early duty at the Pearl Dock. He nudged Cripple Wah in the ribs and pointed wordlessly. Now the stranger was standing on the quayside, watching several straining seamen carry a large brass-bound chest down the gangplank. Another man, obviously the captain, was standing beside him. There was about the seaman every nerve in blind Hugh's body, which tended to vibrate in the presence of even a small amount of impure gold at 50 paces, screamed into his brain the air of one anticipating imminent enrichment. Sure enough, when the chest had been deposited on the cobbles, the stranger reached into a pouch, and there was a flash of coins. Several coins. Gold! Blind Hugh, his body twanging like a hazel rod in the presence of water, whistled to himself. Then he nudged Wah again and sent him scurrying off down a nearby alley into the heart of the city. When the captain walked back onto the ship, leaving the newcomer looking faintly bewildered on the quayside, Blind Hugh snatched up his begging cup and made his way across the street with an ingratiating leer. At the sight of him, the stranger started to fumble urgently with his money pouch. "Good day to thee, sire," Blind Hugh began, and found himself looking up into a face with 4 eyes in it. He turned to run. Said the stranger, and grabbed his arm. Hugh was aware that the sailors were lining the rail of the ship were laughing at him. At the same time, his specialized senses detecting an overpowering impression of money. He froze. The stranger let go quickly, thumbed through a small black book he had taken from his belt. Then he said, "Hallo!" "What?" said Hugh. The man looked blank. "Hallo?" he repeated again, rather louder than necessary, and so carefully that Hugh could hear the vowels tinkling in the place. "Hallo yourself," Hugh reposited. The stranger smiled widely, fumbled yet again into his pouch. This time his hand came out holding a large gold coin. It was, in fact, slightly larger than an $8,000 Ankhian crown, and the design on it was unfamiliar, but it spoke inside Hugh's mind in a language he understood perfectly. "My current owner," it said, "is in need of succor and assistance. Why not give it to him so you and me can go off somewhere and enjoy ourselves?" Subtle changes in the beggar's posture made the stranger feel more at ease. He consulted the small book again. I wish to be directed to a hotel, tavern, or let me do the voice right. I wish to be directed to a hotel, tavern, lodging house, inn, hospice, caravanserai, he said. "What, all of them?" said Hugh, taken aback. "Huh?" said the stranger. Hugh was aware of a small crowd of fishwives, shellfish diggers, and freelance goppers were watching him with interest. "Look," he said, "I know a good tavern. Is that enough?" He shuddered to think of the gold coin escaping from his life. He'd keep that one, even if Ymor confiscated all the rest. And the big chest that comprised most of the newcomer's luggage looked to be full of gold, Hugh decided. The four-eyed man looked at his book. I would like to be directed to a hotel, place of repose, tavern. Yes, all right, come on then, said Hugh hurriedly. He picked up one of the bundles and walked away quickly. The stranger, after a moment's hesitation, strolled after him. A train of thought shunted its way through Hugh's mind. Getting the newcomer to the broken drum so easily was a stroke of luck. No doubt about it, Ymor would probably reward him. But for all his new acquaintance's mildness, there was something about him that made Hugh uneasy. And for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what it was. Not the 2 extra eyes, odd though they were. There was something else. He glanced back. The little man was ambling along in the middle of the street, looking around with an expression of keen interest. Something else Hugh saw nearly made him gibber. The massive wooden chest, which had last been seen resting solidly on the quayside, was following on its master's heels with a gentle rocking gait. Slowly, in case of a sudden movement on his part might break the fragile control over his own legs, Hugh bent slightly so that he could see under the chest. There were lots and lots of little legs. Very deliberately, Hugh turned around and walked very carefully towards the broken drum. Odd, said Ymor. He had this big wooden chest, added Cripple Wall. He'd have to be a merchant or a spy, said Ymor. Pulled a scrap of meat from the cutlet in his hand and tossed it into the air. He hadn't reached the zenith of the arc before a black shape detached itself from the shadows in the corner of the room, swooped down, taking the morsel in midair. A merchant or a spy, repeated Ymor. I'd prefer a spy. A spy pays for himself twice, because there's always a reward when we turn him in. What do you think, Withil? Opposite, Ymor. The second greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork half closed his one eye and shrugged. I've checked on the ship, he said. It's a freelance trader. Does the occasional run to Brown Islands. People there are just savages. They don't understand about spies, and I expect they eat merchants. He looked a bit like a merchant, volunteered Wall, except he wasn't fat. There was a flutter of wings at the window. Ymor shifted his bulk out of the chair, crossed the room, coming back with a large raven. He unfastened the message capsule from its leg and flew up to join its fellows lurking among the rafters. Withil regarded it without love. Ymor's ravens were notoriously loyal to their master, to the extent that Withil's one attempt to promote himself to the rank of greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork had cost their master's right hand, his left eye. But not his life. However, Ymor never begrudged a man his ambitions. B12, said Ymor, tossing the little file aside and unrolling the tiny scroll. Gorin the cat, said Withil automatically, on station up in the Gong Tower at the Temple of Small Gods. He says Hugh has taken our stranger to the broken drum. Well, that's good enough. Boardman is a friend of ours, isn't he? Aye, said Withil. If he knows what's good for trade, among his customers has been your man, Gorin, said Ymor pleasantly. For he writes here about a box on legs. If I read this scrawl correctly. He looked at Withil over the top of the paper. Withil looked away. He will be disciplined, he said flatly. Wall looked at the man leaning back in his chair, his black-clad frame resting nonchalantly as a rimland puma on a jungle branch, and decided that Gorin atop the small god's temple would soon be joining those little deities up in the multifold dimensions of beyond. And he owed Wah 3 copper pieces. Ymor crumpled the note and tossed it into a corner. I think we'll wander along to the drum later on, Withil. Perhaps too. We may try this beer that your men find so tempting. Withil said nothing. Being Ymor's right-hand man was like being gently flogged to death with scented bootlaces. Scented bootlaces? Interesting. The twin city of Ankh-Morpork, foremost of all the cities bounding the Circle Sea, was, as a matter of course, the home of a large number of gangs, thieves' guilds, syndicates, and similar organizations. This was one of the reasons for its wealth. Most of the humbler folk on the Wittershan's side of the river, in Morpork's lazy alleys, supplemented their meager incomes by filling some small role for one or the other of the competing gangs. So it was that by the time Hugh and Twoflower had entered the courtyard of the Broken Drum, the leaders of a number of them were aware that someone had arrived in the city who appeared to have much treasure. Some reports from the more observant spies included details about a book that told the stranger what to say, and a box that walked by itself. These facts were immediately discarded. No magician capable of such enchantments came within a mile of the Morpork docks. It still being that hour when most of the city was just rising or about to go to bed, there were few people in the drum to watch Twoflower descend the stairs. When the luggage appeared behind him and started to lurch confidently down the steps, the customers at the rough wooden tables, as one man, looked suspiciously at their drinks. Rodman was browbeating the small troll who swept the bar when the trio walked past him. "What in the heck's that?" he said. "Just don't talk about it," hissed Hugh. Twoflower was already thumbing through his book. "What's he doing?" said Rodman, arms akimbo. "It tells him what to say." "I know it sounds ridiculous," muttered Hugh. "How can a book tell a man what to say?" "I wish for an accommodation, a room, lodgings, the lodging house, full board. Are your rooms clean? A room with a view? What is your rate for one night?" said Twoflower in one breath. Rodman looked at Hugh. The beggar shrugged. "He's got plenty money," he said. "Tell him it's 3 copper pieces, then, and that thing will have to go in the stable." "Eh?" said the stranger. Rodman picked up 3 thick red fingers in the man's face. Suddenly a sunny display of comprehension. He reached into his pouch and laid 3 large gold pieces in Rodman's palm. Rodman stared at them. They represented about 4 times the worth of the Broken Drum, staff included. He looked at Hugh. There was no help there. He looked at the stranger. He swallowed. "Yes," he said in an unnaturally high voice. "And there's meals, of course. Oh, you understand? Yes, food. You eat. No?" He made appropriate motions. "Foot?" said the little man. "Yes," said Rodman, beginning to sweat. "Have a look in your little book. I should." The man opened the book and ran a finger down one page. Rodman, who could read after a fashion, peered over the top of the volume. What he saw made no sense. "Food," said the stranger. "Yes, cutlet, hash, chop stew, ragout, fricassee, mince, scallops, souffle, dumpling, blancmange, sorbet, gruel, sausage, not to have a sausage, beans without a bean, kickshaws, jelly jam, giblets." He beamed at Rodman. "All that?" said the innkeeper weakly. "It's just the way he talks," said Hugh. "Don't ask me why. He just does." All the eyes in the room were watching the stranger, except for a pair belonging to Rincewind the wizard, who was sitting in the darkest corners nursing a mug of very small beer. He was watching the luggage. Watch Rincewind. Look at him, scrawny, like most wizards, and clad in a dark red robe, on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. Some might have taken him for a mere apprentice enchanter who had run away from his master out of defiance, boredom, fear, or a lingering taste for heterosexuality. Yet around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the high school of magic whose time and space transcendent campus is never precisely here or there. Graduates were usually destined for maidship at least, but Rincewind, after an unfortunate event, had left knowing only one spell, and made a living of sorts around town by capitalizing on an innate gift for languages. He avoided work as a rule, but had a quickness of wit that put his acquaintances in mind of a bright rodent, and he knew sapient pearwood when he saw it. He was seeing it now, and he didn't quite believe it. An archmage, by dint of great effort and much expenditure of time, might eventually obtain a small staff made from the timber of the sapient pear tree. It grew only on the sites of ancient magic. There were probably no more than 2 such staffs in all the cities in the Circle Sea. A large chest of it, Rincewind tried to work out, and decided that even if the box were crammed with star opals and sticks of aruculatum, ariculatum, the contents would not be worth 1/10 the price of the container. A vein started to throb in his forehead. He stood up and made his way to the trio. "May I be of assistance?" he ventured. "Shove off, Rincewind," snarled Broadman. "Only thought it might be useful to address this gentleman in his own tongue," said the wizard gently. "He's doing all right on his own," said the innkeeper, who took a few steps backward. Rincewind smiled politely at the stranger and tried a few words of Chimeran. He prided himself on his fluency in the tongue, but the stranger looked only bemused. "It won't work," said Hugh knowledgeably. "It's the book, you see. It tells him what to say. Magic." Rincewind switched to High Borogravian, to Vanglemisht, to Smutri, and even Black Urugu, the language with no nouns and only one adjective, which is obscene. It was met with polite incomprehension. In desperation he tried a heathen trob, and the little man's face split into a delighted grin. "At last," he said. "My good sir, this is remarkable." Although in trob the last word became a thing which may happen but once in the usable lifetime of canoe hollowed diligently by axe and fire from the tallest diamond-wood tree that grows in noted diamond-wood forests on the lower slopes of Mount Awhile, home of fire gods, or so it is said. "What was all that?" said Broadman suspiciously. "What did the innkeeper say?" said the little man. Rincewind swallowed. "Rodman," he said, "2 mugs of your best ale, please." "You can understand him?" "Oh, sure. Tell him he's very welcome. Tell him breakfast is 1 gold piece." For the moment Broadman's face looked as though some vast internal struggle was going on. Then he added with a burst of generosity, "I'll throw in yours too. Stranger," said Rincewind levelly, "you stay here, you'll be knifed or poisoned by nightfall. But don't stop smiling, or so will I." "Oh, come now," said the stranger, looking around. "This looks like a delightful place. Genuine Morporkian Tavern. I've heard so much about them. You know, all these quaint old beams. So reasonable, too." Rincewind glanced around quickly, in case some of the leakage of enchantment from the magician's quarter across the river had momentarily transported them to some other place. No, this is still the interior of the drum, its walls stained with smoke, its floor a compost of old rushes and nameless beetles, its sour beer not so much purchased as merely hired for a while. He tried to fit the image around the words quaint, or rather the nearest trob equivalent, which was the pleasant oddity of design found in the little corral houses of the sponge-eating pygmies on the High Peninsula. His mind reeled back from the effort. The visitor went on. "My name is Twoflower," and extended his hand. Instinctively the other 3 looked to see if there was a coin in it. "Pleased to meet you," said Rincewind. "I'm Rincewind. Look, I wasn't joking. This is a tough place." "Good. Exactly what I wanted." "Eh? What is this stuff in the mugs?" "This? Beer." "Thanks, Broadman." "Yes, beer. You know beer." "Ah, the so typical drink. A small gold piece will be sufficient payment, do you think? I do not want to cause offense." It was already half out of his purse. "Yart!" croaked Rincewind. "I mean, no, it won't cause offense." "Good. You say this is a tough place, frequented, you mean, by heroes and men of adventure?" Rincewind considered this. "Yes," he managed. "Excellent. I would like to meet some." explanation occurred to the wizard. Ah, he said, you've come to hire mercenaries, or warriors who fight for the tribe with most milk nut meal. That language is weird. Oh no, I just want to meet them so that when I get home I can say I did it. Rincewind thought about meeting with the drums. Thought that a meeting with most of the drum's clientele would mean that Twoflower never went home again unless he lived downriver and happened to float past. Where is your home? He inquired. Ryman had slipped away into some back room, he noticed. Hugh was watching them suspiciously from a nearby table. Have you heard of the city of Bezpalargic? Well, I didn't spend much time in Trob. I was just passing through, you know. Oh, it's not in Trob. I speak Trob because there are many Betrobi sailors in our ports. Bezpalargic is a major seaport of the Adjutian Empire. Never heard of it, I'm afraid. Twoflower raised his eyebrows. No? It's quite big. You sail turnwise from the Brown Islands for about a week, and there it is. Are you all right? He hurried around the table and patted the wizard on the back. Rincewind choked on his beer. The counterweight continent. 3 streets away, an old man dropped the coin into a saucer of acid. It swirled it gently. Rodman waited impatiently, ill at ease, in a room made noisome by vats of bubbling beakers and lined with shelves containing shadowy shapes suggestive of skulls and stuffed impossibilities. Well, he demanded. One cannot hurry these things, said the old alchemist peevishly. A saying takes time. He prodded the saucer where the coin now lay in a swirl of green color. He made some calculations on a scrap of parchment. Exceptionally interesting, he said at last. Is it genuine? The old man pursed his lips. It depends on how you define the term. If you mean, is this coin the same as, say, a $50 piece, then the answer is no. I knew it! Screamed the innkeeper and started towards the door. I'm not sure that I'm making myself clear, said the alchemist. Rodman turned around angrily. What do you mean? Well, you see, what with one thing and another, our coinage has been somewhat watered over the years. The gold content of the average coin is barely 4 parts in 12. The balance being made of silver, copper. What of it? Like I said, this coin is like ours. It's pure gold. The Brahmin left. At a run, the alchemist spent some time staring at the ceiling, then drew out a very small piece of thin parchment, rummaged for a pen amongst the debris of his workbench, and wrote a very short, small message. Then he went over to the cages of white doves, black cockerels, and other laboratory animals. From one cage he removed a glossy-coated rat, rolled the parchment into a file attached to a hind leg, and let the animal go. Sniffed around the floor for a moment, then disappeared down a hole in the far wall. It was about this time a hitherto unsuccessful fortune-teller living on the other side of the block chanced a glass into her scrying bowl, gave a small scream, and within the hour had sold her jewelry, various magical accoutrements, and most of her clothes, and almost all of her other possessions that could not be conveniently carried on the fastest horse she could buy. The fact that later, when her house collapsed in flames, she herself died in a freak landslide in the Morpork Mountains proves that death, too, has a sense of humor. Curse you, death! Also, at about the same moment as the homing rat disappeared into the maze of runs under the city, scurrying along in faultless obedience to an ancient instinct, the patrician of Ankh-Morpork picked up letters delivered to him that morning by an albatross. He looked pensively at the topmost one again, and summoned his chief of spies. And in the broken drum, Rincewind was listening open-mouthed as Twoflower talked. So I decided to see for myself, the little man was saying. 8 years saving up, this has cost me, but worth every half rinthu. I mean, here I am, in Ankh-Morpork, famed in song and story. I mean, in the streets. They have known the tread of Herrick Whiteblade, Hrun the Barbarian, Brav the Hublander, and the Weasel. It's just like I imagined, you know. Rincewind's face was a mask of fascinated horror. I just couldn't stand it anymore back in Bezpalargic, Twoflower went on blithely, sitting at a desk all day just adding up columns of figures, just a pension to look forward to at the end of it. Where's the romance in that? Twoflower thought, it's now or never. Twoflower, I thought, it's now or never. You don't have time to... You don't just have to listen to the stories, you can go there. Now's the time to stop hanging around the docks listening to the sailors' tales. So I compiled a phrase book and bought passage on the next ship to the Brown Islands. No guards? Murmured Rincewind. No. Why? What have I got worth stealing? Rincewind coughed. You have gold, he said. Barely 2,000 Rinthu. Hardly enough to keep a man alive for more than a month or two at home. That is, I imagine they might stretch a bit further here. Would a Rinthu be one of those big gold coins? Said Rincewind. Yes. Twoflower looked worriedly at the wizard over the top of his strange seeing lenses. Will 2,000 be sufficient, you think? Yarr! Croaked Rincewind. I mean, yes, sufficient. Good. I mean, is everyone in the Adjutian Empire as rich as you? Me? Rich? Bless you. Whatever did put that idea into your head? I'm but a poor clerk. Did I pay the innkeeper too much, do you think? Twoflower added. He might have settled for less, Rincewind conceded. Ah, well, I shall know better next time. I can see that I have a lot to learn. An idea occurs to me, Rincewind. Would you perhaps consent to be employed as a... I don't know, perhaps the word guide would fit the circumstances? I think I could afford to pay you a Rinthu a day. Rincewind opened his mouth to reply, but felt the words huddled together in his throat, reluctant to emerge in a world that was rapidly going mad. Twoflower blushed. I have offended you. It was an impertinent request to make of a professional man such as yourself. Doubtless you have many projects you wish to return to. Some works of high magic, no doubt. No, said Rincewind faintly. Not at present. A Rinthu, you say? One a day. Every day? I think perhaps in the circumstances I could make it 1 and 1/2 Rinthu a day. Plus any out-of-pocket expenses, of course. The wizard rallied magnificently. That will be fine, he said. Great. Twoflower reached into his pouch, took out a large, round gold object, glanced at it for a moment, then slipped it back. Rincewind didn't get a chance to see it properly. I think, said the tourist, that I would like to see the rest now. It was a long crossing, and then perhaps you would like to call back at noon? I would like to have a little rest. Okay, not see the rest. Call back at noon, and we can take a look at the city? Sure. Then please be good enough to ask the innkeeper to show me to my room. Rincewind did so, and watched a nervous broadman who arrived at a gallop from the back room lead the way up the wooden steps behind the bar. After a few seconds, the luggage got up, pattered across the floor after them. Then the wizard looked down at the 6 big coins on his hand. Twoflower had insisted on paying for his first 4 days' wages in advance. Hugh nodded and smiled encouragingly. Rincewind snarled at him. As a student, Rincewind had never achieved high marks in precognition, but now unused circuits in his brain were throbbing, and the future might as well have been engraved in bright colors on his eyeballs. The space between his shoulder blades began to itch. A sensible thing to do was to buy a horse. It would have to be a fast one, and expensive. Offhand, Rincewind couldn't think of any horse dealer he knew was rich enough to give change out of a whole ounce of gold. And then, of course, the other 5 coins would help him set up a useful practice at some safe distance, say 200 miles. That would be the sensible thing. But what would happen to Twoflower all alone in the city where even the cockroaches had an unerring instinct for gold? The man would have to be a real heel to leave him. The patrician smiled, but with his mouth only. The hub gate, you say, he murmured. The guard captain saluted smartly. Aye, lord. We had to shoot the horse before he would stop. Which, by a fairly direct route, brings you here, said the patrician, looking down at Rincewind. The hub gate, you say, he murmured. Guard captain Slinsbury. We had to shoot the horse before he would stop. Which, by a fairly direct route, brings you here, said the patrician, looking down at Rincewind. And what have you got to say for yourself? So, he decided to be a real heel, buy the horse, and book it. If you didn't catch that. It was rumored that an entire wing in the patrician's palace was filled with clerks who spent day after day collating and updating all the information collected by their master's exquisitely organized spy system. Rincewind didn't doubt it. He glanced towards the balcony that ran down the side of the audience room. A sudden run, a nimble jump, a sudden hail of crossbow quarrels. He shuddered. The patrician cradled his chins in a beringed hand and regarded the wizard with eyes as small and hard as beads. "Let me see," he said, oath-breaking. "The theft of the horse, uh, uttering false coinage. Yes, I think it's the arena for you." Rincewind. This was too much. "I didn't steal the horse. I bought it fairly." "But with false coinage. Technical theft, you see." "Those are Rinthu. Those Rinthu are solid gold." "Rinthu?" The patrician rolled one of them around in his thick fingers. "Is that what they are called? How interesting. But as you point out, they're not very similar to dollars." "Well, of course they're not." "Ah, you admit it then." Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it, and shut it again. "Quite so. On top of that, there is the moral obloquy attendant on the cowardly betrayal of a visitor to this shore. For shame, Rincewind." The patrician waved a hand vaguely. The guards behind Rincewind backed away, and their captain took a few paces to the right. Rincewind suddenly felt very alone. It is said that when a wizard is about to die, Death himself turns up to claim him, instead of delegating the task to a subordinate, such as disease or famine. It is usually the case. Rincewind looked around nervously for a tall figure in black. Wizards, even failed wizards, have, in addition to rods and cones in their eyeballs, the tiny octagons enable them to see into the far octarine, the basic color of which all others are merely pale shadows impinging on normal four-dimensional space. It is said to be a sort of fluorescent greenish yellow purple. "Was that a flickering shadow in the corner?" "Of course," said the patrician. "I could be merciful." The shadow disappeared. Rincewind looked up, an expression of insane hope on his face. "Yes?" he said. The patrician waved a hand again. Rincewind saw the guards leave the chamber. Alone with the overlord of the Twin Cities, he almost wished they would come back. "Come hither, Rincewind," said the patrician. He indicated a bowl of savories on a low onyx table by the throne. "Would you care for a crystallized jellyfish? No?" Said Rincewind. "No." "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say," said the patrician amicably. "Otherwise you will die in an interesting fashion, over a period. Please stop fidgeting like that. Since you are a wizard of sorts, you are of course aware that we live upon a world shaped, as it were, like a disc, and that there is to exist toward the far rim a continent which, though small, is equal in weight to the mighty land masses in this hemicircle, and that, according to ancient legend, is because it is largely made of gold?" Rincewind nodded. Who hadn't heard of the counterweight continent? Some sailors believed the childhood tales and sailed in search of it. Of course, they returned either empty-handed or not at all, probably eaten by giant turtles, in the opinion of more serious mariners. Because, of course, the counterweight continent was nothing more than a solar myth. "It does, of course, exist," said the patrician, "although it is not made of gold. It is true that gold is a very common metal there. Most of the mass is made up by vast deposits of octa-iron deep within the crust. Now, it will be obvious to an incisive mind like yours that the existence of the counterweight continent poses a deadly threat to our people here." He paused, looking at Rincewind open-mouthed. He sighed. He said, "Do you by some chance fail to follow me?" "Yarg!" said Rincewind. He followed and licked his lips. Well, gold." "I see," said the patrician sweetly. "You feel, perhaps, that it would be a marvelous thing to go to the counterweight continent and bring back a shipload of gold?" Rincewind had a feeling of some sort of trap was being set. "Yes?" he ventured. "And if every man on the shores of the Circle Sea had a mountain of gold of his own, would that be a good thing? What would happen? Think carefully." Rincewind's brow furrowed. He thought, "We'd all be rich?" The way the temperature fell at the remark told him it was not the correct one. I may as well tell you, Rincewind, that there is some contact between the Lords of the Circle C and the Emperor of the Agitian Empire, as it is styled. The patrician went on. It is only very slight. There is little common ground between us. We have nothing they want, and they have nothing we can afford. It is an old empire, Rincewind. Old, cunning, and cruel, and very, very rich. So we exchanged fraternal greetings by albatross mail at infrequent intervals. One such letter arrived this morning. A subject of the Emperor appears to have taken into his head to visit our city. It appears he wishes to look at it. Only a madman would possibly undergo all the privations of crossing the turnwise ocean in order to merely look at anything. However, he landed this morning. He might have met a great hero, or the cunningness of thieves, or some wise and great sage. He met you. He has employed you as a guide. You will be a guide, Rincewind, to this looker, this Twoflower. You will be a guide. You will see that he returns home with a good report of our little homeland. What do you say to that? Thank you, Lord, said Rincewind miserably. There is another point, of course. It would be a tragedy should anything untoward happen to our little visitor. It would be dreadful if he were to die, for example. Dreadful for the whole of our land, because the Agitian Emperor looks after his own. He can certainly extinguish us at a mere nod. And that would be dreadful for you, Rincewind, because in the weeks that remained before the Emperor's huge mercenary fleet arrived, certain of my servants would occupy themselves about your person in the hope that avenging captains on their arrival might find their anger tempered by the sight of your still living body. There are certain spells that can prevent life departing from a body, be it never so abused. And I see by your face that understanding dawns. Yarg! I beg your pardon. Yes, Lord. I'll see to it. I'll endeavor to see. I'll try to look after and see that he comes to no harm. He said, and after that, I'll get a job juggling snowballs through heck, he added bitterly in the privacy of his skull. Capital. I gather already that you and Twoflower are on the best of terms. An excellent beginning. When he returns to the safety of his homeland, you will not find me ungrateful. I shall probably even dismiss the charges against you. Thank you, Rincewind. You may go. Rincewind decided not to ask for the return of his 5 remaining Rinthru. He backed away cautiously. Oh, and there is one other thing, the patrician said as the wizard groped for the door handle. Yes, Lord, he replied with a sinking heart. I'm sure you won't dream of trying to escape from your obligations by fleeing the city. I judge you to be a born city person. But you may be sure that the lords of other cities will be apprised of the conditions by nightfall. I assure you that the thought never crossed my mind, Lord. Indeed? Then if I were you, I'd sue my face for slander. Rincewind reached the broken drum at a dead run, and was just in time to collide with a man who came out backwards fast. The stranger's haste was in part accompanied forward by a spear in his chest. He bubbled noisily and dropped dead at the wizard's feet. Rincewind peered around the doorframe and jerked back as a heavy throwing axe whirled past like a partridge. It's probably a lucky throw. A second cautious glance told him the dark interior of the drum was a broil of fighting men, quite a number of them. A third and longer glance confirmed in bits. Rincewind swayed back as a wildly thrown stool sailed past and smashed in the far side of the street. Then he dived in. He was wearing a dark robe made darker by constant wear and irregular washing. In the raging gloom, no one appeared to notice the shadowy shape that shuffled desperately from table to table. At one point, a fighter, staggering back, trod on what felt like fingers. A number of what felt like teeth bit his ankle. He yelped shrilly, dropped his guard just sufficiently for a sword swung by a surprised opponent to skewer him. Rincewind reached the stairway, sucking his bruised hand, and running with a curious bent-over gait. Crossbow quarrel thunked into the banister rail above him, and he gave a whimper. He made the stairs in one breathless rush, expecting at any moment for another more accurate shot. In the corridor above, he stood upright, gasping. He saw the door in front of him scattered with bodies. A big, black, bearded man with a bloody sword in one hand was trying the door handle. "Hey!" screamed Rincewind. The man looked around and then, almost absent-mindedly, drew a short throwing knife from his bandolier and hurled it. Rincewind ducked. There was a brief scream behind him as the crossbow man, sighting the weapon, dropped it and clutched his throat. The big man was already reaching for another knife. Rincewind looked around wildly, and then with wild improvisation drew himself up into a wizardly pose. His hand flung back. "Astani Karacha Bezlabur!" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously from side to side as he waited for the magic. The conclusion was that there was not going to be any. Hit him at the same time as Rincewind, whirring wildly down the passage, kicked him sharply in the groin. Abraca-groin smash. Dabra. I like that. As he screamed and clutched at himself, the wizard dragged open the door, sprang inside, slamming it behind him, threw his body against it, panting. It was quiet in here. There was Twoflower sleeping peacefully on the low bed. There, at the foot of the bed, was the luggage. Rincewind took a few steps forward, cupidity moving him as easily as if he were on little wheels. The chest was open. There were bags inside. One of them he caught the gleam of gold. For a moment, greed overcame caution, and he reached out gingerly. But what was the use? He'd never lived to enjoy it. Reluctantly, he drew his hand back, and was surprised to see a slight tremor in the chest's open lid. Hadn't it shifted slightly, as though rocked by the wind? Rincewind looked at his fingers, and then at the lid. It looked heavy, and was bound with brass bands. It's quite still now. What wind? Rincewind! Twoflower sprang off the bed. The wizard jumped back, wrenching his features into a smile. "My dear chap, right on time. We'll just have lunch, and then I've got a wonderful program lined up for this afternoon." That's great." Rincewind took a deep breath. "Look," he said desperately, "let's eat somewhere else. There's been a bit of a fight down below." "A tavern brawl? Why didn't you wake me up?" "Well, you see..." "What?" "Thought I made myself clear this morning, Rincewind. I want to see genuine Morporkian life. The slave markets, the whore pits, the temple of small gods, the beggars' guild, a genuine tavern brawl." A faint note of suspicion in Twoflower's voice. "You do have them, don't you? You know, people swinging on a chandelier, sword fights over a table, that sort of thing. Run the Barbarian and Weasel are always getting involved in, excitement." Rincewind sat down heavily on the bed. "You want to see a fight?" he said. "Yes, what's wrong with that? For a start, people getting hurt." "Oh, I wasn't suggesting we get involved. I just want to see one, that's all. And some of your famous heroes. You do have some, don't you? It's not all dockside talk?" And now, to the wizard's astonishment, Twoflower was almost pleading. "Oh yeah, we have them all right," said Rincewind hurriedly. He pictured them in his mind and recoiled from the thought. All the heroes of the Circle Sea passed through the gates of Morpork sooner or later. Most of them were for barbaric tribes nearer the frozen hubs, which had a sort of an export trade in heroes. Almost all of them had crude magic swords whose unsuppressed harmonics on the astral plane played heck on with any delicate experiments in applied sorcery for miles around. Rincewind didn't object to them on that score. He knew himself to be a magical dropout, so it didn't bother him that the mere appearance of a hero of the city gates was enough to cause retorts to explode and demons to materialize all throughout the magical quarter. No, what he didn't like about heroes was that they were usually suicidally gloomy when somber, and homicidally insane when drunk. There were too many of them, too. Some of the most notable questing grounds near the city were a veritable hubbub in the season. There was talk of organizing a rota. A rota of heroes? He rubbed his nose. The only heroes he had much time for were Bravd and the Weasel, who were out of town at the moment, and Hrun the Barbarian, who was practically an academic by hub standards, in that he could think without moving his lips. Hrun was said to be roving somewhere turnwise. Look, he said at last, have you ever met a barbarian? Twoflower shook his head. I was afraid of that, said Rincewind. Well, there was a clatter of running feet on the street outside, then a fresh uproar from downstairs. It was followed by a commotion on the stairs, and the door flung open before Rincewind could collect himself sufficiently to make a dash for the window. But instead of the greed-crazed madman he expected, he found himself looking in the round, red face of a sergeant of the watch. He breathed again. Of course the watch were always careful not to intervene too soon in any brawl where the odds were not heavily stacked in their favor. The job carried a pension and attracted the cautious, thoughtful kind of man. The sergeant glowered at Rincewind and peered at Twoflower with interest. Everything all right in here, then? He said. Oh, fine. Got held up, did you? The sergeant ignored him. This the foreigner, then? He inquired. We were just leaving, said Rincewind quickly, and switched to Traub. Twoflower, I think we ought to get lunch somewhere else. I know some places. He marched out the corridor with as much aplomb as he could muster. Twoflower followed, and a few seconds later there was a strangling sound from the sergeant as the luggage closed its lid with a snap, stood up, stretched, and marched out after them. Watchmen were dragging bodies out of the room downstairs. There were no survivors. The watch had ensured this by giving them ample time to escape via the back door, a neat compromise between caution and justice that benefited all parties. Who are all these men? Said Twoflower. Oh, just men, said Rincewind, and before he could stop himself, some part of his brain that had nothing to do took control of his mouth and added, heroes, in fact. Really? When one foot is stuck in the grey miasma of Herol, it is much easier to step right in and sink rather than prolong the struggle. Rincewind let himself go. Yes, that one over there is Erig Strong in the arm. Over there is Black Zanal. Is Hrun the Barbarian here? Twoflower said, looking around eagerly. Rincewind took a deep breath. That's him behind us, he said. The enormity of this lie was so great that its ripples did in fact spread out one of the lower astral planes as far as the magical quarter across the river, where it picked up tremendous velocity from the huge standing wave of power that always hovered there, and bounced wildly across the Circle Sea. The harmonic got as far as Hrun himself, currently fighting a couple of gnolls on a crumbling ledge high in the Cataract Mountains, and caused him a moment's unexplained discomfort. Twoflower, meanwhile, had thrown back the lid of the luggage and was hastily pulling out a heavy black cube. This is fantastic! They're never going to believe this at home. What's he going on about? Said the sergeant doubtfully. He's pleased you rescued us, said Rincewind. He looked sidelong in the black box, expecting it to explode or emit strange musical tones. Ah, said the sergeant. He was staring at the box, too. Twoflower smiled brightly at them. I'd like a record of the event. Do you think you could ask them all to stand over there by the window, please? This won't take a moment. And, Rincewind? Yes? Twoflower stood on tiptoe to whisper. I expect you know what this is, don't you? Rincewind stared down at the box. It had a round glass eye protruding from the center of one face and a lever at the back. Not wholly, he said. It's a device for making pictures quickly, said Twoflower. It's quite a new invention. I'm rather proud of it, but look, I don't think these gentlemen would. I mean, they might be sort of apprehensive. Could you explain it to them? I'll reimburse them for their time, of course. He's got a box with a demon in it that draws pictures, said Rincewind shortly. Do what the madman says and it will give you gold. The watch smiled nervously. I like you in the picture, Rincewind. That's fine. Twoflower took out the golden disc that Rincewind had noticed before, squinted at its unseen face for a moment, muttered, 30 seconds should about do it. Then said, Smile, please. Smile, rasped Rincewind. There was a whir from the box. Right. And I think I'm going to stop here, which is not all the way through the chapter. It's about halfway through the chapter. But, My throat is killing me. But yeah, I intend to finish this book, but let me know what you guys think when I get this up, okay? And we'll see if I continue this little project. For now, you guys take care, and I will talk to you later on.